just want to thank everybody for coming. Thank our panel for making themselves available. Everybody can kind of give a round of applause. I want to thank CUNY for hosting the event and the Parkside group for their support in this. Just a couple of housekeeping items. The next issue for City and State is going to be Organized Labor. That comes out on the 20th. That's going to be the spotlight. And then we're doing another breakfast with Seth Pinsky on September 25th. I'm not going to introduce the panelists because their bios are in the program, and I'll leave it to Morgan to get it started.
I will just go over just really briefly who our panelists are because they are such important and impressive advocates. Marissa Shorenstein, I'm overwhelmed by the litany of your accomplishments. She's been Director of Communications for Andrew Cuomo when he ran for governor, Press Secretary and Deputy Director of Communications for David Patterson. She's been a key advocate for the Jets and private practice, and now as President of AT&T for New York and New Jersey. Justin Krebs is the founder of Living Liberally and Drinking Liberally. I'm sorry, Justin is here. He is an expert in grassroots advocacy and for elections and for issues. Charlie Warzel is currently a staff writer for Adweek. He formerly worked for in thecapital.com and was a producer for NBC News. Evan Stavisky, to my right, is one of our hosts. Thank you very much. He is one of the most accomplished political consultants and issue advocates in New York State. He's worked for practically everybody, nonprofits, Fortune 500 companies, labor groups, and some of the most accomplished politicians in the state. So really the thrust of this conversation is going to be about issue advocacy, how you can frame and present your advocacy messages to communicate effectively with the audiences you're trying to influence, and to understand the various vehicles and strategies available to you as someone who wants to accomplish or to push an issue. And so I'd like to just start off by asking, what is the range of issue advocacy and what are the different vehicles for advocating? And is advocating synonymous with lobbying? And how can we get over the sense of lobbying as being kind of a tainted word?
Sorry, please. I think everybody needs to remember that advocacy and lobbying are at the core of 2 of the 5 freedoms that are in the First Amendment. The First Amendment talks about freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and the right to petition government for redress of grievances. So freedom of speech is at its core supposed to be about political speech. It's supposed to be about having an opinion on issues and an opinion on candidates. So advocacy by itself is part of the American fabric. So how do we move from that to sort of the subject today? You know, the range of advocacy that goes on can be from, the very large, well-financed corporate enterprises. Say every time you see a Pepsi truck go by and there's a sign on it that says, that has a message from New Yorkers for Beverage Choices, which is a project of the Beverage Association, all the way down to the very granular level. When I worked in government, I worked in the state assembly, did my fair share, maybe more than my fair share of constituent problems. And when 3 neighbors on a corner say that the street is dangerous and it needs a 4-way stop sign, that's another way to petition government for redress of grievances. So it really runs the gamut from the really granular local issues of a couple of neighbors calling their politicians and asking for help, all the way up to large corporate enterprises spending millions of dollars to defend their point of view, their product line, and their business interests.
Go down the line, Morgan?
Yeah, please.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I agree that advocacy is not a bad thing or a dirty word, and that lobbying doesn't have to be either. It is when it's in the service of something bad or evil, which it often is at greater expense. But if you're 3 people advocating for a stop sign on your street corner, that is as equal a range of advocacy. Or if you're lobbying for more teachers in schools, or better funding of children's health programs, or new regulations to regulate carbon emissions, you're lobbying as well. And unfortunately, the word lobbying, and thus the word advocacy, as Morgan indicated, sometimes get tainted, but they shouldn't be. Fundamentally, what you're doing is you're gathering people together and trying to make a change. It doesn't only have to be advocacy that's targeted at government. Advocacy can be targeted at a corporation, or advocacy can be targeted at a landlord, at a school, at a business owner. Advocacy is any time that you start getting together and speaking on your behalf. I'm going to spend a little bit more just introducing kind of where I come from on this, because I am going to talk from a slightly different perspective than other folks on the panel. As Morgan said, I run Living Liberally. We create social events around progressive politics. A lot of what we do is give liberals around the country a way to connect with each other, learn from each other, and we work with a lot of advocates around the country who want to find like-minded people who are supporting or interested in their campaigns. We also help labor unions, environmental groups, immigration rights groups, good government groups develop different kind of campaigns that can reach new audiences through new messaging and new media. When I was thinking about advocacy for today, I actually wanted to tell a story of my favorite recent advocacy campaign going on that is not one that I've worked on. So I want to give somebody else and a whole bunch of other people a lot of credit. A few weeks ago, I would say, this room is probably a little bit higher information than your average New York room about city policy. But a few weeks ago, I would say most people did not think paid sick leave was a pressing issue in the city. If you work within city council and within lobbying, you probably knew that it was something that had been debated. But if you asked the typical New Yorker, you might think, one, there was no chance paid sick leave would ever happen. Two, if there was any champion of it, it would probably be the liberal speaker of city council, Christine Quinn, and probably Mayor Bloomberg was on the other side, and that if it were really almost going to happen, you'd hear about it. Well, the fact is paid sick leave as a bill is something that has a veto-proof majority of city council supporting it. So it's actually not the mayor who's stopping it, it's the speaker, Christine Quinn, who's keeping it from a vote. This came up recently in a really specific way that I found fun. Gloria Steinem, a great and respected woman who is also Christine Quinn's supporter, came out in an article saying that she thought Christine Quinn should allow a vote on paid sick leave. For those of you who don't know, it's requiring businesses to allow some number of paid days when you or your family members are sick. Because I don't want a counter person sneezing in my soup. I don't want them thinking about their sick kid or bringing their sick kid to work. I would rather them stay home and get healthy. So Gloria Steinem called on Christine Quinn to allow this to a vote. Christine Quinn, relying on her strategy team, said, okay, we need to create some advocacy on our own side. We need to speak on our behalf. Let's get a equally celebrity notable endorser to back our side. And they got Susan Sarandon to start tweeting her support of Christine Quinn, that she supports her and she believes in workers' rights and so forth, and that this wasn't the key issue. The world of the Twitter sphere turned on Susan Sarandon with such quick and effective and unapologetic force that within a day, Susan Sarandon, who had not thought that much in detail about the issue, was backpedaling over Twitter and was saying, I've heard that this actually worked in San Francisco and didn't hurt small businesses. Maybe this does deserve consideration. From the Quinn perspective, it was kind of a little embarrassment, only for those people who were following it. But in this case, it was actually advocacy targeted at Susan Sarandon. How did this happen? People on Twitter started targeting her very public Twitter handle, which is like @SusanSarandon or something like that, saying things like, Thelma and Louise would have wanted paid sick leave, why don't you? Susan Sarandon is used to being loved, used to being praised, idolized, admired, especially by liberals. And suddenly, the liberal community was saying to her, why are you turning your back on Thelma and Louise? And she backpedaled from it. I mean, not only because of that pressure, she learned about the issue, she got engaged, but that advocacy took place in a way that would have been almost unheard of a number of years ago. And that's the element that I want to focus on when we talk about the vehicles and mechanisms for advocacy. It can involve paid advertising, it can involve big firms. It can also involve now a series of new media tools that didn't exist 10 years ago. Grassroots organizing has always been the same, and when you advocate, there are certain questions you need to ask. What do you want? Who has the decision to make it happen? Who does that person listen to? How many stakeholders can I gather together? How can I get even more stakeholders than that? And what message can these stakeholders communicate to the people that decider listens to that will cut through the noise? Whether you're trying to push a soda ban or prevent a soda ban, push paid sick leave or prevent it, you're going to ask those same questions. Whether you're a paid corporate advocate or a grassroots advocate, you're going to ask the same question. The thing that the Netroots, this network of online tools and organizations have added, is a lot of tools that people can use for free. It does not replace grassroots advocacy, but it supplements it in ways that couldn't have been done before, where the traditional gatekeepers are not there preventing you from communicating to a celebrity like Susan Sarandon, which might have once been an obstacle. Where tools like change.org and signon.org allow you to reach people that you never would find on your street corner to sign petitions. Again, online petitions are not going to be the thing that creates change all the time, but it does, along with new media, video, YouTube, blogging, provides a range of channels that have really changed the dynamic of what grassroots organizing can look like. And that's what I'm happy to answer questions about and talk more about as we go on.
So I agree with and have a lot of things to say about a lot of what you were talking about, you know, being a digital reporter and sort of living my life 16 hours a day on the internet. You know, I think in terms of, you know, is advocacy a bad or tainted word? I mean, no, there are 100 million active users on Twitter that are advocates every day and every minute and every second. And I think that the internet, and particularly the open internet, has completely changed everything. Reddit's founder, Alexis Ohanian, said, the world isn't flat, but the World Wide Web is. And, you know, that's sort of like, that was the SOPA statement for, you know, advocating for the open internet. And it's true, it's become a tool that, I mean, if you look at what happened, let's just say during the open internet and the SOPA blackout back in January, even before that, just when people were hearing that there was this bill, that was going to censor the free internet, Tumblr blacked out their website for 24 hours, and their 87,000 calls went into Congress, and it was like 4,000 hours just of normal internet denizens talking to congressional reps when the internet blacked out, and Wikipedia and Reddit and a lot of those sites shut down in January to protest the SOPA and PIPA. There were 1 million emails sent to Congress, and I mean, and these aren't even things that actually even take that much. I mean, people were clicking buttons to send emails. I mean, advocacy is very easy, and I mean, and if you look at, everyone's an advocate every second whenever they step on and, you know, produce some sort of statement via, say, Twitter. I mean, look at NBC fail from the Olympics, people, you know, upset with tape delay, or, you know, mad because their live stream doesn't work at their cubicle because they can't authenticate their Time Warner account. You know, I mean, you got hundreds of thousands of people being advocates, and it can be about, you know, stupid stuff or stuff that doesn't really matter, but I mean, the internet's just changed and given everyone a voice, so I think it's more important now than ever.
I'd be particularly curious to hear what Justin thinks about whether the internet is all good for advocacy, because I think that advocacy and lobbying are synonymous, really, and I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think that advocacy really only works at its best when there's a specific end goal in sight. And a lot of what the internet now promotes is advocacy in general, for sort of overarching issues that people are unhappy about, but with no specific end game. I think we sort of saw that with Occupy Wall Street to a certain extent. There was an end game, but it was a little amorphous in the sense that there wasn't a specific piece of legislation that everyone agreed with, or something very specific. And I really believe that you can only be truly effective as an advocate and have a really full advocacy campaign when you have a very specific goal in mind, whether it's government-oriented or not. It could be corporate, it could be something else, it could be the streetlight, but it really needs to have that purpose. And I think one of the problems that I've seen with the internet and with Twitter and with all of these social media tools is that you're just having people now expound on everything all the time, and that is not always useful in conversation to get to an end goal. So, you know, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think.
I mean, I largely agree. Saying you care about an issue does not equal advocacy for that issue. It certainly doesn't equal lobbying for that issue. The example I'll give is actually a pre-internet era example, not pre-internet, but pre-online advocacy era example, and then I'll get back to how I think the internet connects, which is I actually 12 years ago I worked with a guy who's in this room on a Parks advocacy campaign called Parks 2001. The problem that this campaign defined was that everyone in the city liked parks. Now, why is that a problem? Well, if you just go around saying, I like parks, and everyone agrees, and everyone who's running for mayor in 2001, and everyone running for city council in 2001 says, I like parks, everyone's equal, right? Oh, you like parks? If someone had come out and said, I don't like parks, then you would have had a campaign to run. But everyone liked parks. So this Parks 2001 campaign said, it's not enough to get people to like parks, we have to have something we're advocating for. It has to be specific. And they launched a campaign called 1% for parks. Dedicate 1% of the city budget for parks. Doesn't matter if you think that's a good number or not. It is specific, it is targeted, people understand, they can take a yes or a no. A lot of people won't say yes because it's a preposterous thing when you're running for mayor to say you're going to dedicate a certain percentage of the budget. But the more they said no, the more you could take all those people who said that they like parks, all of the young parents and rec leagues and bird watchers and community gardeners and cycling advocates and say, you all say you like parks, now do something about it. These candidates they say they like parks, but they don't like them as much as you do. Here's a specific goal. I think the difference between an organization that gets liked, an issue that gets cared about, and advocacy is exactly what Marissa said and what I was saying before. You have something that you want to change, you know what it is you're trying to accomplish, and you know who it is that can make that change, which is just as important. In terms of your point about the internet, I don't think that's changed the dynamic. I agree with you that liking an organization on Facebook is about as useless in terms of advocacy as liking parks or liking healthcare. But probably less so, right? But if that organization does more in terms of collecting email addresses, collecting mailing addresses, holding meetings where they meet people face to face, and then build a community that cares about an issue and says, okay, as a community, we are now not just liking a free internet, we are working to stop the SOPA legislation, then it changes.
I guess my point is only that I think now that people have a way to voice their opinion that's public in a way that they didn't used to, that they feel like their point of view should be answered somehow, but they're not actually advocating for something. And I think that's a dangerous road that we're going down, where every single person in this world has something to say, and all of it is valuable and important, but it needs to often be used in a more sort of useful forum.
Yeah, I mean, look, I tend to agree. I think there's a very big difference between having an opinion on something and actually advocating or taking some steps that lead to concrete either policy or corporate changes and get some results. I'll give you guys an example of a campaign I've done for many years. One of my clients is the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. They are one of the largest unions in the country. I represent the local here in New York City grocery store clerks. So Fairway, Pathmark, the unionized supermarket folks. One of their biggest opponents in life is Walmart. I think everybody's generally familiar with the concept of why unions have a problem with Walmart. 5 years ago, 8 years ago, when we first started looking to build a coalition about preventing Walmart from opening in the city, it was a very different thing. But it's very different from people having an opinion as to whether or not Walmart should come into the city or whether a specific proposal gets approved or not. And the difference there is it's not just about having an opinion, it's about how do you galvanize that public opinion towards a constructive action. And I think that really draws the distinction with what Marissa was talking about, where Occupy Wall Street might have many laudable goals, but whether or not there's a roadmap on how to actually achieve those goals from gathering in Zuccotti Park is a subject that we can have a whole separate discussion on. But real advocacy means having a strategy, it means having an organizing principle, it means having not just a method for persuading the public, but for galvanizing that public opinion towards specific actions. That could be talking to a town board or the city council to oppose a particular development that might lead to the opening of a Walmart. It could be towards a particular piece of legislation, as we did when the city council passed the Healthcare Security Act, which is the first legislation in the country that would have billed companies like Walmart that don't provide health care for the cost of Medicaid for their employees. So the very big sort of threshold question is have you moved past having an opinion on something to is there a strategy and an organizing effort to be able to galvanize that opinion towards some type of action?
Marissa, I wanted to ask you, what is an example of an advocacy campaign that you've been involved in that you felt like has really made a difference?
JETS. I think on both sides of the aisle, that campaign was one of the best examples I can think of in the past decade of using sort of every possible strategy to get to an end goal. Happened to work with a lot of people in this room on it, from Parkside to Lou Coletti over there. And, I think that there were a lot of valuable lessons from it. I mean, we did everything from paid advertising to building a very diverse coalition from Al Sharpton to Rudy Giuliani, which doesn't happen that often, to galvanizing labor, to using Joe Namath, to doing all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, what I think I learned is that we targeted two specific different groups. We targeted the public to gain their support so that they could lean on public officials, and we targeted public officials. As many of you may know, that decision was ultimately made by a 3-person board called the PACB in Albany. And so at the end of the day, did we need to do as much work as we did to organize to get the public really into it? I'm not sure. I think that in retrospect, maybe we could have spent less time engaging the public and more time engaging just a simple strategy to get to those 3 people. But that was, for me, an example of how beyond paid advertising and earned media, but using every tool possible through organizing, having 25,000 person labor rallies on the west side of Manhattan, to busing up labor and meeting Joe Namath in Albany at the Capitol, and everything and anything under the sun, just was a really, really great lesson in how to run a campaign.
And for those of the people in the audience who may be interested in engaging an advocacy firm, I mean, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of an advocacy firm, and what is, I guess this is particularly directed at you, Evan, and at you, Marissa. What is the benefit in hiring a professional advocate versus launching and orchestrating your own campaign?
So I think you need to have a sense of what it is you're trying to achieve and what it is you're getting out of it. I mean, it is absolutely possible for people to do grassroots organizing. I mean, one of the most effective, meaningful campaigns didn't have outside firms. It was, a few years before. I used to work for a group called NIPERG that some of you might know. It was one of my first jobs out of college. And shortly before I got there, they had, at the culmination of a long campaign, passed something called the Toxic Victims Access to Justice Act. Basically, the way the law was in New York was you could be exposed to a harmful chemical like asbestos, and you had 3 years from the time you were exposed with which to sue whoever caused you to develop cancer 20 years from now. The problem is, obviously, you didn't know you were going to have cancer in 20 years. So it reopened the case and allowed people to go back and seek justice for injuries that were caused decades later. It was an incredibly difficult campaign. It was a statewide campaign, incredible amount of focus placed on then Senate Majority Leader Warren Anderson in Binghamton, and there were no outside firms involved. It was a huge grassroots undertaking, however, and there were professionals involved internally who were organizing the community, who were organizing in Albany, who were galvanizing public opinion through the press and through community activities. So if you're going to engage a firm, I think the first question is, what is it you're trying to achieve? And I mentioned toxic torts. Senator Orenstein was probably in the Senate when the toxic torts legislation passed, so he'd probably remember the details far better than I. But you don't necessarily need to. I certainly don't want to encourage people not to hire firms. Let me be very clear about that, right? But you need to have a sense of what it is you're trying to achieve, what your internal capacity is, and you need to think of it the same way as you're making a business decision, either in the corporate or nonprofit world, which is, do you have an in-house lawyer or do you have an outside lawyer? Do you have an in-house accounting firm or in-house bookkeeper or an outside accounting firm, or both? And what are the roles that each plays? And anytime you bring in professionals, you need to be able to consider it from that context, which is, what is it I'm trying to get, how much value am I going to get out of an external relationship as an internal relationship? And it's just another form of professional that you bring in to help you achieve your goals.
I agree with that. I think you have to evaluate your resources internally and then determine what you need. I mean, the case of the Jets, both the Dolan family on one side and us, pretty much used every single consultant in the tri-state area for one part of the project or other. We were employing people for years, and they didn't need any other clients. Whether or not that was the best strategy, I don't know. A lot of people sometimes hire consultants just so that other people won't, because they're good at their jobs and they want them to be locked up and not be advocating on the other side. And there's certainly something to be said for that. But I think it's really about evaluating your resources internally and knowing what you need and knowing specifically what you want from a consultant. Is it one relationship of theirs that's meaningful to you? Is it a holistic approach? Do you need multiple people doing different types of work? And just hiring someone to hire someone is usually not the best strategy, because often you're not going to get what you thought you're going to get. You really want to go into it hiring someone for a specific purpose and knowing what that goal is in advance.
Just to piggyback on something Marissa said, there are times where we get approached specifically around, say, a more conventional institution, organization, nonprofit that's trying to do new media work. And they say, we really want to blog, we really want to tweet. But they haven't thought about their internal capacity. So you have to ask them, is somebody in your office going to be responsible for tweeting every day? Multiple times a day if you actually want to make use of it. Because if that's now an additional new task being piled onto your communications director, or if that's taking time away from your development person's ability to fundraise, not in a strategic, thought out way. This actually takes resources. We might tell you now's not the time to tweet. It was actually even more pronounced with blogging for about 5 years in the middle of the last decade, because everyone would want to start blogging, and nothing is, at least if you have a Twitter feed that's not tweeting, people forget about you. If you have a blog prominent on your website that doesn't have new content every now and again, it looks like your organization stopped existing. And that's it's something that you have to really make sure people realize, that if they're hiring you as a consultant, are you giving them a set of ideas that they're going to act upon? Can they actually follow through? Or are they trying to hire you to ongoing be their development team, be their communication team, be their new media team, which is a lot more cost and requires a lot more commitment from them to really be giving time to this week in and week out.
Charlie, as a journalist, you're oftentimes the target of advocacy campaigns. And I want to know what resonates with you, what gets your attention when someone is trying to get their story placed with you or make an impact in your publication.
There's always volume and repetition and things like that can wear people, in journalism down. That's probably not what anyone wants to hear, but,
Or it can get you blacklisted.
Right. Well, that too. But if you hire a good PR person who keeps pitching and the story is compelling, after a while you just So, yeah, there it is. But in terms of approaching the press, finding someone who, having a concrete message that, and a strategy and a plan with, whether you hire an outside firm or, are going internal, that's obviously very important. But also, the biggest thing, and especially when you try to throw new media into it, is to be human. And that is, working for Adweek, and listening to a lot of advertisers, there's all sorts of new, ways that people are trying to connect on the internet, just brands and marketers with, the general public. And you go to a conference or you go to wherever, and I think this works directly with, with advocacy. You go to a conference for 2 hours, listen to people talk, and the thesis is be human. It's but we too often forget that, you need to draw eyes, and you need to draw, more than just that, support. You want your story to resonate, and that goes far beyond the journalist that you choose or the outreach. It's about crafting a message that will hit home with a group of people. And I think that's very simple, but I think it often goes, unseen. And I think very, very similar when you're talking about, new media and the blogging and things like that. just because you have a company blog doesn't mean people care what you have to say, or just because your group has a blog, you have to engage. You have to make people care, and that's the same thing with Twitter. You go out and you have, even if you have someone who's in your communications office, I'm going to tweet once every hour about this certain thing. If you don't interact with people, that's a big problem, and especially with brands, you find the best ones listen and listen and listen, and then react, and often solicit people who are just talking about a certain thing. And it's not necessarily, hey, we crafted this blog post, and it's 5 paragraphs just like usual, and then boom, and there's a link. But instead, listening and finding conversations that are happening on, say, social media, and then very organically, coming into that conversation or drawing someone else in. And people respond to that greatly,
I think that's a great point, Charlie. One of the cardinal errors that I see repeated oftentimes in advertising is something along the lines of like an ad where it's like, what is Staples up to recently, right? And who's sitting around thinking like, I wonder what's going on inside of Staples, right? I mean, advertising. Yeah, right. And that just shows a kind of a blindness on the behalf of the advertiser, where Staples starts to think, wow, we're so important that you care what's going on with Staples. But really, the fundamental question that you're always talking about in advertising should be, what's in it for you, right? What's in it for the consumer? And if you're not directing your issue advocacy to the interests of the people that you're trying to influence, then you're really failing. And if it just becomes about this internal discussion about like, what's going on with the League of Conservation Voters, I mean, no one really cares other than how it's going to affect the people that that League is trying to influence. And Marissa, you drew a really important distinction between issue advocacy directed at elected officials and directed at the public. And I wanted to ask, what is the role of the lobbyist or the advocate? How do you approach elected officials? And what is the utility of having a professional advocate and talking with elected officials? Other than writing big checks.
Right. Well, that's high on the list. Well, I think that largely the tactics are actually the same. It's just that you're targeting a smaller audience. I think that advocacy in general and lobbying is about how does this help you and your constituents? And you have to have a really clear sense of how it does. If it's a very local elected official, how is it going to help the people in my district? If it's a statewide elected official, how is it going to help the state? How is it going to help the economic development of the state? And you really have to come up with those arguments that are larger than that one person. So a lot of issues, certainly with the stadium, was how many jobs is this going to bring to the state? How much money is this going to pump into the economy? Those were the issues that resonated with elected officials. In my current role, it's how is this regulation going to help people service improve? How is what we do in Albany right now and advocate for going to help the cell site in your community give you better service? And those are all things you have to get very granular with when you're talking to elected officials, and so that they can communicate to their constituents how that's going to help their own constituents, and in doing so, they get credit for it. And that's really what you're trying to achieve, is helping an elected official do something good for their constituents and building that goodwill. I think with the larger public, your goal is a little bit broader. You want them to be supportive of something, but they don't have to be voting on it, and so you can sort of be a little broader in your advocacy and have a little more fun with it. I think that's another thing that we have to remember, is that, these campaigns, you have to have a little fun. You have to have a little humor with them, and you can't take yourself so seriously all the time. And that's really something that I think people forget with a lot of these issue advocacy campaigns. They're so, so interested in the core principle that they sort of lose sight of the larger picture. And to your point, Charlie, about, how do you get the attention of someone? One of the things that it sticks out to me is probably the most fun thing that I did in my entire time in the past 15 years that I can remember was during the Jets Stadium issue. We dressed the team in all the same suit, and we gave them each the same briefcase filled with the RFP, and they marched into the MTA and they delivered the RFP to the MTA for the air rights over the Hudson Yards. And it was very like Men in Black, and honestly, it's the one thing I remember from that entire campaign was seeing on the television at night 20 huge football players with these weird little briefcases like marching into the MTA. And so, you know, was that a useful public tool to engage the public? Yes. Was it a useful tool with elected officials? Absolutely not. They thought we were completely insane. So I think you have to know, you know, it is very different. There's different things you do for different audiences, but at the end of the day, it's about how is this going to help me and my constituents.
Yeah, I completely agree with Marissa, and it just reminds me of a story that sort of connects back to something Morgan was just talking about, which is, you know, I've done a lot of political campaigns. It's one of our practice areas. Won over 100 campaigns in the last several years. And one of the biggest mistakes that candidates make is the same mistake that advocacy groups or interest groups make, which is the discussion isn't about you and it's not about who's on the other side. Even the presidential race, it's not about Barack Obama, it's not about Mitt Romney, it's about the American people and what do they care about. So the proper discussion is not what Staples up to. The proper discussion is, and you know, not to pick on Staples specifically, but the proper discussion is, you know, what is it that people actually care about and what is Staples' role in actually meeting those needs? So what that kind of brings me back to when Marissa was talking about it is, I was doing a campaign for the NFL Network, and you know, frequently we get called upon either to create campaigns soup to nuts on behalf of individual groups, or occasionally handle the New York piece of national campaigns. And sometimes that'll involve engaging local elected officials or localities in a particular area in order to influence national politics. So we were doing a campaign for the NFL Network, and they were in the midst of a carriage dispute with the cable companies. So if everybody remembers, the most famous one was when Cablevision wouldn't carry the Yes Network and the Yankees weren't on TV in the Bronx. So there was a similar issue involving the NFL Network for years. And we were hired to build a coalition around it. And in fact, in New York City, Cablevision's franchise was coming up for review. So what we did was we did community organizing, and when the borough hearings were going on, there were dozens and dozens of people who showed up from all over Brooklyn holding signs at the hearing about whether or not Cablevision should still be allowed to still be allowed to have the franchise for cable service in Brooklyn, holding signs saying why Cablevision was unfair to their community. And it was almost like Pearl Harbor in that it was completely unexpected. 50 people came out of nowhere for a hearing that generally nobody shows up on, and Cablevision went berserk. Right? It completely not only got under their skin, it infected their psyche, and they had no idea how to handle the fact that all of a sudden people were coming out of nowhere to go attack them at their, at their bread and butter, which was the renewal of their cable franchise. So it's, you know, when sometimes things may be targeted at elected officials, sometimes these activities are actually targeted as a who's on the other side, just to get inside their head, kick the furniture around, and kind of mess up, like, you know, their thinking a little bit.
Should advocacy campaigns, should they always entail, should there always be a grassroots component in an advocacy campaign?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's a corporate interest or a nonprofit or anything that's going on. I mean, one of my clients is the satellite TV industry. I represent DirecTV and Dish Network. We actually advise them on grassroots strategy nationally. When they're involved in something as mundane as tax issues, one of the first things that happens, in addition to hiring local lobbyists, is we think about how do we engage our subscribers. So it may be different techniques that all derive to talking to subscribers and hundreds of thousands in an individual state, and then connecting those subscribers with their legislators. I'm sure AT&T does the same thing on issues of concern. Any large company is foolish if they don't recognize that they have their own constituency. It could be their employers, could be their customers, but in some way you need to be able to engage the public, because otherwise it becomes just a dispute between companies, and legislators zone out, the public zones out. I'm sure reporters zone out to some degree beyond interest of who's fighting between themselves. But, you need to have something that kind of makes it real, makes it tangible, and kind of connects it back to individual people if you want to have any opportunity to advance the discussion.
Well, we all know that the best way to reach elected officials in New York State is by advertising in city and state. But I wanted to ask you, what in general are the benefits and the drawbacks of paid media in approaching an advocacy campaign?
I think it depends on the advocacy campaign. A lot of companies, big companies think, well, I'm just going to put an ad in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and that's all I need to do, and that's all people read, and that's going to sort of solve my problem. But the truth is that people in Brooklyn read the Brooklyn papers, and people in Queens read the Queens papers, and if you're going to have an effective campaign, then you really need to do all sorts of advertising, not just the big. So it depends on the issue, though. I mean, if your target is simply Wall Street, then you should be advertising in the Wall Street Journal. If your target is more grassroots, then you need to think about those things. But I do think paid advertising, has worked over time. There's no question of that. It's not in dispute. TV and print ads work, and there's a reason people do them, and I don't think they're effective completely on their own, but they're an important part of every campaign, just like Grassroots is. I think you need all the parts to make a successful campaign.
I think you need to also make sure with any sort of advertising that you do, any sort of paid media, that it doesn't then alienate or work against the grassroots section or the human element of it. And it just goes back again to that idea that when you're advertising, you want to tell a story and you want to connect, but at the same time, you don't want to erode. You see it on the national level a lot, I think. You have candidates come out and talk about synergy and being a better America and things like that, and then a super PAC will come out with an attack ad that that is just very toxic, and and some people respond to that. Obviously, they do, and it can be really good to get get yourself into the news cycle. But at the same time, it can also just completely erode the message. And when you start, especially if you go with any sort of negative campaign in anything, if you build up that toxicity level, it starts to erode anything that you say about anything with a real human element, because that's sort of an inhuman campaign. So you have to just make sure that everything, fits together, and one message isn't slowly, undermining and eroding the other.
If I can speak to Charlie's point, and then I'll answer the question about paid advertising. Because you now brought up twice this sort of notion of being human, or what you also hear a lot about it being online is being authentic, but it's not just online. One of the things that recently that has turned me off, because I wasn't sure where I was going to fall on this soda ban question. I hadn't thought a whole lot about it. Boy, did the paid advertising by the soda industry turn me off. Because I feel like for me, and I don't know what the polling says, and I'm not maybe their target audience, I've seen ads for years done by the Department of Health of the city about sugary drinks and what they do to you and how much you have to walk, that felt very personal. It felt like they were answering the question, not what is the Department of Health up to, but holy cow, what's happening in my body? How is the Department of Health helping me? And then suddenly, one day, there were ads everywhere on the subway saying, your freedom to drink what you want. And it came out of nowhere, and it was big, and it was clearly expensive, and it felt corporate, and it wasn't really I was like, yeah, maybe you should have your freedom to drink what you want. But really, it was so obvious that it was a very expensive, well-funded campaign. And that turned me off. That coupled, and this might just be the pro-soda ban people doing a very good job pitching stories, but the same day that I saw these ads, there was also the article about the soda industry paying canvassers. And I'm sure there are people who are genuinely grassroots level against a soda ban, but now all I can think of is they're paying canvassers to astroturf this issue, they're blanketing my subway with ads. I now get it. Big money and big soda is trying to convince me of something, and it totally turned me off because it didn't feel authentic. The other quick thing I was going to say about paid advertising, I don't do paid advertising in our work by and large, but there actually is, for folks who are like, we can't buy newspaper ads, we can't buy TV ads in the New York market, certainly. There is an increasing amount of research out there about ways to use like targeted Facebook ads. Don't just buy Facebook ads, but if you are targeting Walmart workers to create a change within the Walmart corporate structure, you can actually buy ads that will appear on the Facebook pages and those side columns of people who have said where they work. So you could target employees of Fox News. You can target people who have said they have certain interests. It's gotten to the point where it's beyond, I am liberal and you want to have an ad sent to them, but like where they work, where they live, and those can be extremely, extremely effective to the point that I've seen some of these done as tests where it's like, hey, staff member of whatever office is written on the side. If I'm speaking to you, click here. And the person's like, I am working in this office. This is clearly a message to me. And it's just like a very well-tailored Facebook ad. I don't know if you have experience with that at all.
Yeah, I mean, look, the technology that exists and the online tools to be able to transfer people's opinions to direct action that we talked about before are incredible. So Marissa's absolutely right when she talks about being able to get at the granular level, target individual communities, weekly papers, trade publications like City and State. If you want to infect sort of the public consciousness, look, how many people get the morning email, right? Probably everybody here gets the morning email, right? Arrives roughly at 6:30 in the morning, and there's very smart advertising throughout it that enables you to talk directly to the political chattering class. But it goes beyond that at the grassroots level, where if you want to run an ad in, say, the Queens Chronicle, it's not just about having an ad, it's also about driving traffic to a website. Having that website use a tool called CapWiz that enables people to directly email, or better yet, fax their individual legislators. It's about combining that with like smart online advertising, taking advantage of the segmentation that exists to be able to get very, very, very specific as to who you're talking about. Sometimes, partnering that with things like direct mail that will give you, little business reply cards that come back to you. So there's a real opportunity to use advertising not just to make your opinion, but also drive people to take action. And really, fundamentally, that's what I think is key.
I just hope that Evan's point about his plug for advertising in the morning email was caught on video, because it would make really it's the first thing everyone in the chattering class reads, and he's right.
Justin, first of all, that was a brilliant point. Second of all, I thought you made another excellent point about the micro-targeting on Facebook. I have a friend of mine from Queens who, his company was trying to get Fresh Direct as a client. This was early on in Facebook, although you have Fresh Direct as a client too.
They are my clients.
But he started taking out an ad campaign that was geared directly at Fresh Direct executives, and it was just like these Facebook ads like, I know you're a Fresh Direct executive, and because you pay cost by impression, he ended up getting what was a $100,000 account for $3.70 because he was only targeting like 10 people in this really direct advocacy campaign. One of the things that kind of stops people from, I feel like, going into lobbying is that it seems like there are all these laws and restrictions around it and being a registered lobbyist, and that there can be prosecution or consequences if you're lobbying illegally. And I want to know, what are some of the real pitfalls or areas that people should be conscientious and careful about when they think about entering into the lobbying arena?
Don't break the law.
That's good advice.
I think that, being a lobbyist comes with its pluses and minuses in terms of what you can and can't do. It's beneficial because you can't give as much money away to people, so that's a good thing. But there's the same limitations when you're not a lobbyist. If you work in government, you can fall into the same issues, and you're not technically a registered lobbyist. I think the bottom line is you need to know what the rules are, what the rules of engagement are before you engage. And too many people don't know those rules, or think that they can get around them, or think that people aren't watching. But at the end of the day, this applies to everything in life, really, not just lobbying. I don't think it's any different for lobbyists or for elected officials who choose to sort of skirt the law and then get caught. I think it's basically the same for no matter what profession you're in. You should know the limitations and stay within them. Then, it's not easier or harder than anything else.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is err on the side of asking. Yeah, err on the side of caution. Err on the side of asking. Recognize that this stuff is governed at the federal level in different ways than it is at the state and local level. that if you're doing state and local advocacy, you've got both the city clerk and the state JCOPE that each have their own disclosure cycles to get the same information on different schedules. So it actually is kind of complex. So when in doubt, call and ask, because sometimes the rules can seem like a moving target. Sometimes activities that everybody, by popular belief or by common understanding, thought were okay, we're now subject to disclosure. So the way we do it in my company is we err on the side of disclosing everything. It's just not worth the hassle of trying to make a point. But when in doubt, everybody should just call JCOPE, call the city clerk, call the federal entities that regulate this stuff, and ask questions. And then, when in doubt, talk to your
good
either
lawyer.
in-house or external lawyer, because people, it's difficult to regulate the industry because of its roots in the First Amendment, but the regulation exists, and it's very detailed. It's not to prohibit activity, it's all to require disclosure, but what requires disclosure can be, again, some people may view it as a moving target. Very important that you call people and ask.
And I would just say, not from the professional lobbying side, but if your organization is doing advocacy, if you're doing advocacy, a big concern is burnout. I know that's not really what you were asking, but it's worth hearing if that's what you're thinking about. Marissa's story is interesting about the Jets because two sides fought really hard, and I think both sides were glad that eventually it came to an end. Sometimes you
very
lose an
glad.
advocacy campaign, and that's okay. You learn from it. You get better for next time for whatever you're doing. It gives you a chance to debrief. If you're in an ongoing fight, you'll get burned out. Your volunteers, your supporters will get burned out, which goes back to the point Marissa made very early on about having a very specific goal, a goal that maybe exists within a legislative session, exists by the time a authority makes a regulation change, because that allows you to then stop, take stock, come up with the next campaign, recharge, debrief, congratulate, celebrate, buy people a beer. But basically you can't let your volunteers and your true grassroots burn out. You have to be reporting back to them in a way that allows them to know that there is an end and that there is a goal in sight.
Well, I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to go to Q&A from the audience. I know that, Evan, your firm works in a lot of different aspects of advocacy, whether it's doing campaigns or issue advocacy or crisis management. And I want to know, what is the spectrum of services that an issue advocacy firm offers, and how do you know which is the right firm for you?
Well, I know which is the right firm for me. Look, first you got to understand what is it you're trying to achieve, and what are the capabilities of who you're talking to. So there's some firms that are, one-person shop, somebody's working out of their living room, and that's fine as long as they don't have 30 clients, because you can't necessarily manage that workload with one person. Then you have larger firms like mine, where you have a good team of talented professionals, everybody from folks with backgrounds in community organizing to politics to in-house creative people. So, we're able to do a campaign soup to nuts in-house, whether that's, bringing in folks to organize in any community of the city, or whether that's producing, websites, issue ads, TV commercials, all in-house. So what you want to understand is, just like with any other professional you consider hiring, you got to know what it is you're looking for them to do, and what is their internal capacity, because sometimes it makes sense to hire somebody who then farms everything else out, but usually that's not just a good investment of people's money. So what kind of capabilities, what kind of capacity do they have to be able to meet your very specific needs? And is there not just a strategy towards victory, but the ability to actually do each of the elements without having to then bring in 1 million people? Because the reality is most campaigns aren't the Jets versus Cablevision. Right? God bless that campaign. We had a lot of fun working with Marissa and Lou and the cast of thousands who are on our side. But generally, most campaigns aren't going to have everybody in the city working on one side or the other. So you need to be able to understand, what it is you're trying to get, and what are the capabilities that a firm can offer to you.
I would just say, to your point, if you're hiring a firm because you're hiring a specific person, then know that that person is going to be working for you, and not other people. And so I think that's just something that people often don't think about, but you need to ask those questions in advance. Are you paying for one person, or are you paying for a whole firm? Are you paying for people who work for that person? But those are questions that you need to be very mindful of before you sign a contract with someone.
Questions from the audience? I'm not sure. Andrew, do we have a microphone in the audience? Yeah, we have one right here.
Hi, I'm Devin Boyle. I'm the Director of Communications for Democrats for Education Reform. And my question is, in this day and age with all the open forums, Twitter, Facebook, how do you deal with not just some constructive criticism, but some of the vitriolic comments that can come through those types of open forums, particularly from people that may not be as well versed in your issues or the policy and politics that are around that issue?
I mean, this goes to Marissa's point before of now that there is a channel that can make anyone's voice national, do they have a greater responsibility to use that voice in a thoughtful way if they expect an answer? There's no single great answer to that, but a couple I'll give you is one, if you don't want to have a negative online presence, work really hard to have a positive, authentic online presence. This dates back maybe 2 election cycles, but there were a lot of elected officials, even in like the 05 race on the city level, there were a number of candidates that were like, whoa, don't want to go near the internet, it's too scary. Well, fine, if you don't go on the internet, you know who is, the people who want to badmouth you. The way to combat that is to be very proactive. It's ideally to have grassroots, true allies who are out there speaking on your behalf. The other thing I'd say is you don't have to respond to every fight. You don't have to take everyone's voice equally seriously. You do if they're speaking into a large enough audience, but at time you have to think, are they speaking to an audience that is always going to disagree with what you're doing anyway? If somebody is commenting about a liberal opinion post I wrote for WNYC to a religious right Christian website, I might have fun going on and like battling back in the comments section, but it's not, that's more for fun. I'm not really trying to convince. At half the time I don't respond when they write things in the It's a Free Country comments page because I'm like, all right, you guys are just here to shout in a somewhat irresponsible way, but boy, do I love it when other people who are on my side have the time to fight back in the comments section. So that's not a complete answer to say that you can sometimes ignore it, but I do think that focusing on what your proactive presence is the best advice I'd ever given to an elected official and probably works for an organization as well.
There's a saying on the internet, don't feed the trolls. And you shouldn't antagonize, especially if you're a bigger organization, and it never works. But one thing, especially on social media, is, and especially if you're a corporation or a larger group of any kind, people like to pick fights with these big, faceless entities. But if someone does respond and engage you on the other end, a lot of times people are like, oh my gosh, there's a human on the other end of that. There's something like, and if either a sympathetic voice, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you're just gonna like get into a flame war with someone that's gonna, burn up in your face. But I think, a lot of people are often shocked when there's like a reasoned, legitimate, clearly another person on the other side that comes back to you. And I think that's overlooked, and just a lot of times just being reasonable with a lot of these people, they like to stand up to the big nameless entity, but then when you see something on the other end,
or being reasonable will get, being a person, hey, my name is, sorry, it was Nevin? Devin, sorry. My name is Devin, and here's my take on it. 80% of people who are tossing abuse at you will say, oh wait, you're a real person. The 20% who still abuse, they now look marginalized, and they start to embarrass the other people who had agreed with them. And that's a useful thing. The one thing don't create fake identities to pick the fight with them. Ideally, if you as an organization don't want to pick a fight with somebody, get a friend of yours, a grassroots person, a supporter, because then the fight is between supporters on both sides. When you pick I'm sure there are many successful cases of creating fake online entities to pick this fight, but like last week when Chick-fil-A did it, it was one more day of a bad news cycle for them. Like you don't want to be caught now like doing that kind of that explicitly deceptive astroturfing.
reporters love when corporations make stuff up and you can catch them, so not good.
And you'll find that oftentimes those kind of online antagonists are like serial amateur online antagonists. It's like if you read the political blogs on a regular basis, it's like the same three nuts who are throwing, all their ire at you. So you just encourage them if you engage with them. You know who you are. Yeah. Please, microphone.
Yeah, it's going around.
Oh, okay.
Jose Davila, Hispanic Federation. A lot of us are going to continue to bang away at the current administration and the city council to try to get things out of them, but the time's running out and there's going to be a new administration in 2014. Would love to pick your brain on the couple of really good ideas about how to start weighing in, now through the election, and then particularly after the election when there's a new mayor and a new speaker and council leadership. What are the most effective strategies to get your priorities out there, whether it's budget items, legislation, appointments, whatever the case may be?
Don't wait till 2014. I mean, generally, there's a few serious candidates for mayor. Start thinking about how you can engage them now. There's a few serious candidates for Speaker of the Council. Start thinking about how to build relationships with them now so that they understand your issues before they're in a position of leadership. I mean, there's no downside to engaging early. I'm not saying that that a nonpartisan group should go endorse a candidate. What I'm saying is go educate people early, help shape their views, same way that New Yorkers for Parks, Mike Klein, was doing when people were running for office a dozen years ago before the 2001 news cycle. Start to engage people early enough so that your issues aren't new to them in 2014, but they're part of the existing dialogue that they're considering now.
And hedge your bets with all the sort of top candidates.
Everyone.
So make sure you're meeting with everyone. As we all know, elections can get weird, and you never know who the front runner is now could not be the winner. So, hedge your bets.
That's absolutely true. And, I'm glad you referenced the Parks 2001 campaign again, because one of the reasons that was launched in 2001 was there were all these open seats, and Parks is never going to be a top issue in people's mind, right? Crime, education, public health, jobs. So one thing is figuring out how your issue connects to all of those issues in some way. But the other was recognizing there was this window of time where there were a lot of really crowded primaries. And no one knew who was going to win for city council, where people are going to win with 15% of the vote in some districts, maybe less, maybe 15. I don't know.
There was some 11-way race. I mean, it was great.
Yeah, and even on the mayor's race, it's when you have a runoff, who knows who's going to be coming second, who knows if they could come in first. So it's really a window where everyone will sit down and talk with you. No one is too good for you for that next year and a half, so meet them now. Doesn't mean they're going to sign on to your issue now, but it means they're going to know you, and one of them's going to get elected, and then they'll continue to know you when you walk through the lobbies of city council.
Yes.
Hi, Triada Stampis, Food Bank for New York City. The fatigue issue that Justin raised kind of sparked a question for me about expectation management. Given that a lot of advocacy campaigns are long-term and marked as often by incremental failure as into incremental success, how do you manage expectations for major stakeholders, whether it's your clients, the media, grassroots supporters, the general public?
I don't have a great answer. Certain things, if you're working with a coalition of other partners, make sure everyone is on the same page about what constitutes a victory, what constitutes the next benchmark. Being clear with them from the start is certainly helpful. If you're working with volunteers, people who are giving their time, making sure they understand the larger strategy. In 2000, my first job out of college was working on Hillary Clinton's first Senate run, and I was helping direct volunteers. And all these volunteers were making calls day after day, and they didn't understand. And they said, "Well, I've got somebody," and they said they weren't sure if they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And you're telling me I can't convince them? And I was like, right. Right now we're just calling them. Well, I hadn't worked on a campaign before. I didn't understand that we were doing months of IDing voters so that in that final get out the vote push, we knew who to call. That everyone who came and volunteered and was passionate was like, I want to convince them to vote for Hillary Clinton over Rick Lazio, and here we are just telling them no is a very frustrating answer. But if you say to them, well, you spend a certain number of months getting the data you need to make it that much more effective in the final stretch, people are like, oh, I'm part of a strategy. That's a little bit different than what you asked. That's more on the volunteer level. On the coalition partner level, just as much communication as possible so that everyone knows what goals they're going to and there isn't confusion, especially or between you and if you have a consultant, that you're all on the same page about what you're actually working for, what their responsibility is and your responsibility is.
Yeah, we have time for 2 more questions, please.
Hi, I'm Lex Curry from New Destiny Housing, and my question is sort of related to leadership within like an advocacy campaign. We've basically been talking about having one nonprofit or one agency type, leading the campaign, but is there any sort of advantage of having several organizations lead a campaign, or should it be one person and then have sponsorships along the way?
You can definitely have coalitions. In fact, successful campaigns frequently have a coalition of supporters. The key thing is making sure that everybody's all on the same page, that you're defining both long-term goals and incremental steps towards the ultimate victory along the way, and that everybody's on the same page and that there's constant communication. I mean, if you're going to be successful, everybody's got to be rowing the same direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think from an outward-facing role, it's good to have more organizations that have the same goal. But if internally it's going to cause a lot of strife, then I don't think it's worth it.
Clear decision making. Who is the decider for different questions? If you don't know that, when those questions come up, you'll all get mad at each other.
And just to go back to the last question for a second, I just want to really emphasize an earlier point that Marissa had made about kind of knowing your end game. It's like when you work on a political campaign, you start in your planning on election day and you work backwards so that you know what your strategy is, because you know it's going to crescendo or culminate at this one instance. And so that way you can have perspective on what you're doing throughout the entire campaign. You know, okay, we're 100 days out of election day, and this is when this phase of our attack comes into play. And so that's why it's so important to have that perspective, not just be like, have this nebulous goal and think, okay, we can approach it piecemeal. And I think that's generally the difference between working with someone who is a weathered professional versus a person who's kind of approaching it from an amateur perspective. Yes, last question.
I practice Falun Gong, and it's been persecuted in China for 13 years. And last year, we want to go to the Chinese New Year parade as a group in Chinatown, and we are not allowed to. And we try to find a way that how can we persuade the city government that to allow us to have a fair treatment as the other group, because I understand that the city government has saying that we have to look at other people, but the Chinese government spend a lot of money in paying people to badmouth us, and there's a table in Flushing all year long that the woman is paid by the Chinese consulate, I believe, because we have some evidence about it, and calling us cow and other things. So a lot of people in the Chinese community is misleading by the news media that was controlled by the Chinese government. So we want to know how can we be fairly get our rights in America to go to the parade like the other groups.
Launch an advocacy campaign. I mean, I realize that's glib. So, I mean, so you go back, so you have a specific goal, you want to march in a parade. Now you have to figure out who makes that decision. I don't know the parade in particular, but probably there is some nonprofit entity that runs that parade and makes the rules. Much like the St. Patrick's Day parade doesn't allow gay organizations to march in it as gay organizations down Fifth Avenue. So you're not the only ones being excluded. What's amazing is that one of the most high-profile parades in New York City, at a time where we have a pro-LGBT equality mayor and speaker, we still have that discrimination that takes place in the St. Patrick's Day parade. But that's a case where it's not the city's decision. The city theoretically could revoke the permit from the organization that does it, but they're not going to. It's probably the same in the Chinatown parade, so you have to think who is the actual target there and who do they listen to. The only other note that I'll say is that I see Falun Gong protesters or demonstrators around often, in part because of the peaceful nature of the demonstration. It never asks me to do anything. So my feelings are totally positive. There are a lot of peaceful demonstrators, and I know that there's persecution in China. I would have had no idea what ask you would have made of me as a politically engaged and active New Yorker. So thinking about how you communicate at these very visible sites where the demonstrators are to try to engage a larger community would be an important piece.
All right, I want to thank all our panelists for this very informative discussion. Please give them a round of applause. We'll all try to make ourselves available to you afterwards, and thank you very much for coming to the City and State event.